may I say, 女士们、先生们，晚上好。很高兴欢迎你们来到爱丁堡回家学一位 which is welcome to the Royal Society of Edinburgh. And for all of you now, Chinese included, that's the end of my Chinese. Much easier for me in English and less painful for you. So I'm David Wallace. I'm the Vice President for Physical Sciences and Engineering at the Society. First, some housekeeping. In an emergency, you should leave by the nearest fire exit and assemble outside the George Hotel, which is opposite. Please switch off all mobile telephones and smartphones. And please don't just leave them on silent, because if you get an incoming call, it will interfere with a nearby microphone. So please switch off at this point. The lecture is being audio recorded, and an edited version will be available on the Society's website probably in a couple of weeks. A few words about the Royal Society of Edinburgh itself. It was established by Royal Charter in 1783, and it is the embodiment of the Enlightenment in Scotland, with a simple and profound mission to advance learning and useful knowledge. So as Scotland's National Academy, we enjoy very strong links with our counterpart national academies in China. And the eagle-eyed amongst you, when you came along the corridor, may well have noted that we have the certificates of agreement with the Chinese Academy of Sciences, Chinese Academy of Engineering, Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, and the National Science Foundation of China. These are really important links for us, which bring together top academics and indeed practitioners in business now in both countries to our mutual benefit. Much of the initiative and credit for developing these links should go to our immediate past president, Sir John Arbuthnot, and to his predecessor, Lord Wilson of Tiliorn, who was the penultimate governor in Hong Kong. Now, as the host for this lecture by Sir Sebastian Wood, it's therefore a very great pleasure for the Royal Society of Edinburgh to be working with the Confucius Institute of Scotland in the University of Edinburgh. So Sir Timothy O'Shea, the Principal and Vice-Chancellor, will introduce the speaker. Suffice for me to say that when places were made available, this lecture was overbooked overnight, and indeed there are many people in the overspill room. And could I end on a personal note from me, just to say that as a current participant of a course in Mandarin at the Confucius Institute, I am again a student at the University of Edinburgh, more than 50 years after I first matriculated there as a student in mathematical physics. Anyway, enough from me. Welcome all, and please now welcome Sir Tim.
Thank you very much, Sir David. And he was a brilliant student of mathematical physics, was a stellar career, and as we see, becoming a brilliant student of Mandarin. We are confident, David. Your Excellency, Consul General, ladies and gentlemen, I'm really delighted that we're in this wonderful venue. We really appreciate the Royal Society of Edinburgh helping us in this way, and as was mentioned, there are memorandum of agreements between the Royal Society of Edinburgh and the various leading scientific Chinese academies, and we are really very pleased because from that point of view, for a lecture series where we're trying to build links and understanding between Scotland and China, particularly in intellectual and academic dimensions as well as business dimensions, there is no better location for tonight's talk. The Confucius Institute for Scotland's Business Lecture Series has been tremendously successful. It's now in its third year. Since the series started, the size and mix of the audience have really improved. We have a wonderfully strong advisory board, and we've had speakers such as the former chairman of Goldman Sachs, Jim O'Neill, the current president of BP China, Chen Liming, and next month, on Monday the 10th of November, Victor Zhang, president of the Brussels office of Huawei Technologies. We are really privileged with tonight's speaker, Sir Sebastian Wood, British Ambassador to China, who obviously represents Her Majesty the Queen and the UK government in China and determines the work and direction of the embassy and its consulates. So this is a very broad brief and obviously one of the most important ambassadorial posts in the world, if not the most important, and includes guidance of political work, trade and investment, press and cultural relations, as well as the more mundane visa and consular services. He's been in this post since 2010, and that means he's key to every discussion of any significance concerning UK-China relations. So we're really deeply honoured and absolutely delighted that he's agreed to speak tonight, and it's with immense pleasure that I ask Sir Sebastian to address you.
Well, thank you very much, Sir Tim, for that gracious introduction. Sir David, thank you. Consul General, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. It's lovely to be back in Edinburgh. I come here from time to time. My daughter is a student at the university. If she can fit me into her packed schedule, she may join us a little later this evening. It's surprising how many pundits these days who've never actually been to China write books about it. It seems to me that a couple come out every week or so. Experts who visit regularly are a little more cautious in my experience. They tend to write articles and opinion pieces. And people who've lived in China for several years struggle even to write a paragraph about the country. And after 5 years in China myself, I think I begin to understand why this might be. The longer you live in China, the more you become aware of its complexity and its contradictions. It is a country that defies generalizations. And one of my former ambassadorial colleagues in Beijing, he put this rather more pithily. He said, "The term China expert is an oxymoron, and anyone who describes himself as a China expert is a moron." So I step onto this platform with some trepidation, not as a China expert, but as someone who's had 5 years of stimulating and confusing and contradictory experience of that extraordinary country. Just a week or two ago, some of you may have noticed, the World Bank quietly published a report which noted that China, measured by a yardstick which economists call purchasing power parity, was now the world's largest economy, larger even than the United States. That is an extraordinary, even shocking fact. Over a period of some 200 years in the West, we've become entirely accustomed to a world in which the world's leading economies, and certainly the world's biggest economy, first the UK and then the United States, had a language, a culture, had politics and values with which we were familiar and comfortable. China has a very different history, a very different civilization and political system, and in the space of just a few years it's now moved, at least on this one measure of purchasing power, into the first position. This is, ladies and gentlemen, quite extraordinary. It's an extraordinary moment in history. But it's worth remembering that what we are seeing is, in a sense, a re-establishment of normality. For 18 of the last 20 centuries, economists tell us, China has been the world's leading economy, not least by virtue of its sheer size, the size of its population. So you could say that the 19th and 20th centuries were, in a sense, an aberration, a blip in economic history. But as this new economic reality dawns, on the world in years ahead, it will have a profound impact on all of us, not just political and economic and social, but actually psychological and emotional as well. How are we going to respond to this? Today I want to highlight briefly three dimensions of this seismic shift. I want to talk about an opportunity, a need, and a risk. And I will begin with opportunity, because I think that the UK in particular, for us in particular in this country, the next few decades of China's development offer historic and unprecedented opportunity. And to explain why, I've got to indulge in a bit of amateur economics. So to those of you who are proper economists in the audience, I apologize in advance. When I arrived at the beginning of 2010 in China, I found the country hovering at the threshold of crucial but very difficult reforms. Since Deng Xiaoping had inaugurated the era of reform and opening up, China had been through a quite extraordinary transformation, with a speed and a scale unmatched in modern history. The leaders had taken a series of far-reaching strategic decisions. They greatly relaxed state control over people's lives, allowing farmers first to run small businesses and then to migrate to cities for work, allowing individuals to choose their own employment and travel, not just in China, but also overseas. Opening the country up to foreign investment, privatizing and modernizing huge numbers of inefficient state-owned industries, giving urban residents the right to purchase and sell their apartments, and creating in the process an entire new class of urban consumers, joining the World Trade Organization and opening large areas of China's industry to the discipline of international competition. Cumulatively, those bold moves had changed China out of all recognition, lifting 500 million people above the poverty line. And if you look at it through an economic lens, this great transformation had been based on two things: mobilizing idle or underused resources as peasant labor moved into the factories, and catching up with Western technology as foreign companies exploited the new investment freedoms and moved their technology and their manufacturing into China. For 3 decades, this dynamic process drove Chinese growth at amazingly fast rates. China's economy roughly doubled in size every 7 or 8 years throughout that period. But as we approached the end of the last decade, the end of the noughties, China's leaders, I think, understood that this juggernaut was running out of road. The supply of labor to Chinese factories was getting tighter, wages were rising, other emerging economies were beginning to offer cheaper locations for manufacturing. Many Chinese factories now had state-of-the-art technology by world standards. China's heavily controlled banking system had been acting in effect like a gigantic conveyor belt, taking wealth from individuals and families who were paid an artificially low rate of interest on their savings and had few other savings options. So taking that wealth and transferring it to large corporations, state-owned enterprises for the most part, who were building more and more infrastructure, real estate, and factories. And the rate of return on that infrastructure and real estate was lower and lower. And those trends had been accentuated by the stimulus which was necessary after the global financial crisis. The whole model looked increasingly unsustainable. By late in the last decade, China's leaders were pretty clear on what was needed. Investment needed to slow down, and the financial leverage in the system needed to be reduced. Consumption needed to increase, More had to be done to protect the environment. Chinese people needed to save less and spend more. The services sector needed to develop to provide employment. And having imported most of the technology necessary for a modern economy, China would now need the ability, like other modern economies, to innovate in order to keep growing sustainably. It needed to move from made in China to invented and designed in China. And they were very clear about that in their policy statements. But it's much easier to talk about that than it is actually to do it. Making those changes required tackling very powerful vested interests in China's heavily state-directed economy. For several years, there was rather more talk than action. And then in 2008, the global financial crisis struck. China's investment and credit-led response to that was very effective in supporting both domestic and global growth during a very challenging period, but it also reinforced this rather unsustainable economic growth model. And then the leadership changed in China. That happened in 2012, halfway through my time in China. It was a sort of pivotal moment about which my particular China experience turned. It was a big event for the country, and I would argue it was a big event for the world. It's now clear that China's new leadership, under the General Secretary Xi Jinping, are taking a bolder approach. They've articulated a goal for China's next phase of reform, which is actually quite inspiring. In future, the market should play a decisive role. That's what they say. And in the context of China's political system, this is bold because China's reform process up till now has been heavily state-directed. And that's given enormous economic power and indeed created the opportunity for direct financial gain for an entire generation of senior party and government officials in China. And what the new leadership were effectively saying was that this had to stop. A state-directed, top-down model is fine for a country which is engaged in a systematic process of catching up technologically with the West. But now that China had more or less caught up, the role of the state had to shrink. It had to change essentially from a command and control model to a role of supporting and enabling the wider economy. And only in this way could China become more innovative, reduce waste and environmental damage, and invest its resources more wisely. Today, I think we are beginning to see that reform is beginning to match that rhetoric. It's already clear that there has been some acceleration since the new leaders took office in 2012. Xi Jinping has centralized power. And to show that they mean business, Xi's leadership are taking strong action against corruption, even at the highest levels of the Chinese government. Allowing the market a decisive role, what does that mean in practice? Well, it's going to mean you have to allow some investments to fail and some enterprises to default. It means giving banks more freedom to vary deposit and lending rates. It means allowing the Chinese currency, the renminbi, greater freedom to move against other currencies. It means progressively liberalizing energy and land prices. It means abolishing a lot of government regulations and permissions. It means further opening up China's market to foreign participation, particularly in the services sector. And step by step, I would argue, those things are now beginning to happen. They're not yet making big headlines in the West. We haven't yet seen big bang changes, like allowing peasants to sell their land. That would be a huge change for the Chinese economy, or breaking up the biggest state-owned monopolies, or fully opening China's markets. So there are significant big challenges ahead. But make no mistake, a series of important and systemic economic changes are now underway. Growth has been allowed to slow quite markedly from well over 10% in 2010 to a little over 7% now. That's quite a big deceleration. And with the growth in services, which is happening in China, employment remains strong. So they have been able to decelerate the economic trend growth without giving themselves an unemployment problem. And there's less red tape, and as a result, we've seen a boom in the establishment of private companies in China. Of course, I don't want to pretend that there aren't risks to the outlook. There are risks. The property sector in particular, which has been a major contributor to Chinese growth, is undergoing a slowdown following years of rapid growth. And although credit growth has slowed significantly, China's debt to GDP ratio is still increasing. And the financial sector in China is becoming more complex, which presents real challenges to China's regulators. But on the whole, I am pretty optimistic about China's growth and reform prospects. And that makes me very excited about future opportunities for the UK in particular. So let me try to explain why. The last phase of China's development, with the installation of industrial capacity and the building up of export industries, played very, very well to the economic strengths of another European country, Germany, which is why Germany's trade relationship with China has boomed and is far ahead of any other European country, including us. But the next phase of China's development, this plays very much more to the strengths of the UK. China needs to develop its services, and UK services companies are a great strength of our economy, including here in Scotland, of course, and they are globally competitive. China needs more innovation, and that plays to our strengths in education, research, and innovation. Chinese companies need to internationalize their brands and their businesses, and Britain, and notably, of course, the City of London, is an ideal platform for them to do that. They need to diversify their foreign investments, which are currently dominated by US Treasury bonds and investments in resources in developing countries. And the UK is more open than any other Western country to foreign investment, including, of course, Chinese investment. And just as the UK can provide the things that China needs in this next phase of its development, so China can provide the things which, at this stage of our development here in Britain, we happen to need. We need to rediscover our export mojo, if I can put it like that. And China is, by a country mile, the world's fastest growing major market. We need major investment in our infrastructure, and China has got the capital and the capabilities to help us do that. An entire generation of Chinese are traveling and studying abroad for the first time. Their preferences are being formed even today in China, and we want them to choose the UK. What does all this mean? It means that if things go well, the next 2 decades or so should be a golden period for the economic relationship between the UK and China. The British government has recognized this for some time, and so has the Chinese government. As long ago as 2011, the leaders of our two countries coined a phrase, partnership for growth. It sounds trite, but actually the meaning is quite profound. It says, by doing more trade and investment together, by doing more business together, we can help each other's national development strategies, a partnership for growth. By the time Premier Li Keqiang visited London in June of this year, the Chinese had developed this concept further, and he called it a partnership for growth, reform, and innovation. So much for the theory, you might well say. Is it happening in practice? And I think it is. Over the course of this Parliament, British goods exports to China have more than doubled. Premier Li noted in a speech in June that as China's own growth had slowed, remember I mentioned earlier that trend growth in China has dropped from about 10% to 7%. So as China's own growth had slowed, so had the growth of most Western countries' exports to China, except for the UK. We have bucked that trend. And that, of course, includes exports running into hundreds of millions of pounds from some of Scotland's very best companies, including Howden, AMEC, the Weir Group, and not to mention exports of Scotch whisky, propelled by their very effective and active advocates, the Scotch Whisky Association, whom I've greatly enjoyed supporting in China over the years. So if you think about it, the phenomenon of Chinese growth slowing, but British exports to China accelerating, that does tend to support the theory that our economies are becoming more complementary. And while the export growth has been impressive, the explosion in Chinese investment into the UK has been positively eye-watering. China has noticed how open we are to foreign investment in the UK. In some other countries, big Chinese investment moves have provoked knee-jerk protectionist responses. One other European country, which for diplomatic reasons will remain nameless, invoked national security laws to block the takeover of a yogurt firm. We wouldn't do that. We offer transparency, a genuinely level playing field, doorstep access to the world's premier centre for financial and business services, and a fast route into China's largest overseas market, the EU. This penny has dropped. Over the last couple of years, we've seen more Chinese investment into the UK than in the previous 30 years. So it isn't just a sort of normal acceleration. It's like that moment in Star Trek when, an apparently stationary universe suddenly accelerates into a blur. It's disorientating, the speed with which this shift has happened. And the investment has come from sovereign wealth funds, it's come from state-owned enterprises, and increasingly it's coming from China's very dynamic private sector. And a significant chunk of that investment, again, has come to Scotland. Not least the billions of pounds that Sinopec and CNOOC have invested into the oil and gas sector here. Thirdly, I would cite the education relationship, which it just keeps booming. There are now some 130,000 Chinese students in the UK. That's far more than any other foreign nationality. There was an extraordinary statistic which I still can't quite believe, but there it is. I mean, it's an official statistic. Earlier this year, it was published. Postgraduate students in the UK, some 25% of them are British. 24% of them are Chinese. And student numbers from China are rising at about 10% a year. So within a year or so, we will have more Chinese postgraduate students in our universities in Britain than British postgraduate students. It's amazing. British universities have more than 230 different joint partnerships of various kinds with Chinese universities, from 2+2, 2+1 courses through to full-on joint campuses, and indeed Nottingham have a trailblazing Nottingham University campus in the city of Ningbo in China. Tourism is also booming. China's own figures, which were published only last week, are that 490,000 Chinese people travelled to the UK last year, more than to any other European destination. I'll repeat that because so often I read in the British media that hardly any Chinese tourists come to Britain, and they're all going to France instead. 490,000 came to the UK last year, more than to any other European destination. The Chinese government actually counts its people out and logs where they're going. A very interesting statistic. Incidentally, 20% more than the previous year. So again, we're seeing very, very rapid growth as this generation of Chinese travel abroad for the first time. Chinese scientists now co-author more peer-reviewed research with UK scientists than they do with any other science partner other than the United States. And of course, the Royal Society of Edinburgh have made some very effective efforts to develop collaboration with Chinese partners in crucial new areas such as stratified medicine and biotechnology, and are therefore playing an important part in that process. And then there are booming financial links as well. Britain is already the fastest growing market in Europe for payments in renminbi, China's internationalizing currency. Over 3/4 of Europe's renminbi payments are now done via the UK. So these are the sort of established areas of booming success between the UK and China. But even more exciting, in a way, are the areas of untapped potential between us. The new markets that are only now developing in China as a result of the big changes which are underway there in Chinese economy and society. Let's take healthcare as an example. China is experimenting with bold reforms to improve public health. Private investment, including from abroad, is encouraged. And only a month ago, China lowered the threshold for foreign companies to build and operate hospitals in China. Britain's National Health Service has a very strong brand in China. The British government team in China is working energetically on two fronts. We're working with Chinese policymakers and regulators who are helping to define the rules of this new market. And we're working with British companies, not just in China, but also back here in the UK, to help them address this exciting new opportunity. It's early days, but there are signs that this could be an immensely valuable new area of cooperation for the two countries. For example, in the first 6 months of this year, we recorded wins for UK business in healthcare of £390 million. There are other exciting new areas opening up. Energy and the environment is one example, urbanization and infrastructure is another, financial and professional services is a third, and this is not an exclusive list. And what is exciting about these areas is that they're markets which are still in their infancy in China. New markets in which Britain can be a first mover among foreign participants, in which we can become, in effect, China's knowledge economy partner of choice. What are we doing in China to try and realize these opportunities? We have, I think, rather an innovative and pioneering approach. We're trying to blend diplomacy, policy links with business. This works in China because Chinese policymakers are very, very open-minded and pragmatic, in my experience. They're constantly looking around the world for best practice and for new ideas. They respect certain things about the UK. The fact that we were the first country to industrialize and therefore, in a sense, have the deepest experience of any modern economy. The fact that we have a gift for building stable institutions and for creating rules. Our education and financial services. They respect the fact that we are genuinely open and that we do not discriminate against Chinese investment. And indeed the fact that we've been very successful, one of the most successful countries at tackling pollution over recent decades. All of these factors give the UK a head start in China and mean that Chinese policymakers, with all the challenges that they face, actually want to talk to us. And what we have found, working with Chinese departments, is that by sharing our experiences with the talented officials who are making China's new laws and regulations, by sharing the lessons of our history, of our successes and indeed our mistakes, we can support Chinese reform, we can help create new markets, but we can also help British companies to enter those markets ahead of the competition. And that's why the British government has invested quite substantially in our network in China in recent years. At a time of austerity and shrinking budgets in the public sector, I have seen continuous and rapid growth in the team under my leadership in China. Foreign Office staff numbers alone have increased by about a quarter. We're investing in this relationship because we have a unique opportunity at this moment in China's history, and the British government is determined to take it. So my main message to businesses today is embrace the opportunity of China. It's the world's best consumption story, the fastest growing major market. It's spending huge resources on research and innovation. It has an awful lot of money to invest, whether in China, in the UK, or indeed working in partnership in third countries. We can and we should be doing more business together. Every UK business should ask themselves whether they could export their goods or services to China or whether they could benefit from Chinese investment. Think China. And then come to UK Trade and Investment or come to the China-Britain Business Council for advice on how to access Chinese opportunities. And to young people, I would say, get some China experience. Check out the British Council scheme to support more young Brits to visit China for study and internships. The scheme is called Generation UK. Consider studying Chinese at university, or perhaps choose a course, a 2+2 course or a 2+1 course, which will give you a year or more of study in China. And many UK universities are now offering such courses. Knowledge of China and of Chinese is likely to be the best investment you could make in your own future, an anchor for your future career. I promised to talk about opportunity, a need and a risk. And I've spoken up till now about opportunity because I do believe that our relationship is defined primarily at this stage by opportunity. But let me turn now to the need. China is big. It's about 1/5 of humanity. And even with over 100 million people still living in poverty and relatively low per capita income, the aggregate impact of China on the world is now vast. To take just a couple of examples, China's investment and export-driven growth model generated huge current account surpluses in the years leading up to 2008. This helped to inflate a very large debt bubble in the developed economies, which contributed to the global financial crisis. Now, I'm not assigning blame here. This isn't about right and wrong. It's just an illustration of the interconnectedness of the global economy and the scale of China's impact on it. Another example, China now emits more greenhouse gases than the United States and Europe combined. China's policies have a massive impact on the global fight against dangerous climate change. China's appetite for resources is huge, and fluctuations in Chinese demand have a powerful impact on energy and commodity prices, and therefore on livelihoods and living standards in all the world's major commodities producers, including much of the developing world. And that brings me to the need. The international community now needs China to be actively involved in our collective efforts to address and manage key challenges, from macroeconomic policy coordination in the G20 to maintaining open trade and upholding the WTO, to preventing global warming and preserving the biodiversity of our planet, to combating the spread of antimicrobial resistance and supporting development in the world's least developed countries, not to mention preventing conflict and combating sources of terrorism in the Middle East. We understand, as a Western partner of China, we understand that this is challenging and difficult for China. After all, China is a systemically important player in the global economy at an earlier stage of its development than we have previously seen in modern history. It's absolutely understandable that China remains deeply preoccupied with the domestic challenge of its own development. After all, this is still a country where scores of millions of people live in poverty and where per capita wealth is still only a fraction of what we enjoy in the West. But China's aggregate impact is now so large that the calls for China to show greater leadership are inevitably becoming more urgent and more insistent. And as China passes milestone after milestone, becoming the world's largest PPP economy, per capita CO2 emissions soon to overtake those of the EU, and so on, the international politics are beginning to shift, and the pressure on China to act will increase. So we need China over time to play a bigger role in support of these vital shared international objectives. And in some areas, such as climate change, for example, China is already pursuing a lot of the right policies domestically. And by making an ambitious national contribution to a binding international framework to limit emissions, China would be able to take full international credit for the brave and important domestic policy choices that it is making. So that is my need that I wanted to highlight. Now I'll turn to the risk, which I promised to talk about. Historically, big shifts in relative power have led to tension and conflict. And Thucydides first observed this in his famous study of the Peloponnesian Wars, which I'm sure you've all read. In East Asia, China's dramatic growth is affecting the balance of power. And there are unresolved territorial disputes in the region, and there are lingering historical grievances. The countries of that region still have an overwhelming shared interest in avoiding conflict and pursuing cooperation, and their economies are, in many cases, deeply intertwined. After all, we now live in an age of global supply chains, and we live in an age when the prestige of nations is no longer measured by the number of their imperial possessions. So no one wants conflict, and conflict would be in no one's interests. But it's vital, even so, that China and its neighbours work hard to manage tensions, resolve disputes peacefully, and build stronger mutual understanding over time. Britain, the UK, we don't take a position on the merits of individual territorial claims, but we do have a vital national interest in the continued peace and security of East Asia, which is a region which is now, in many ways, the centre of the global economy, and where hundreds of thousands of our nationals live, and where our companies have billions of dollars invested. So we encourage all countries in the region to avoid any unilateral moves which could increase tensions, and we hope that they will resolve territorial disputes peacefully in line with international law. And we hope too that the countries of the region will set up the channels of communication which are necessary to deal with crises and to prevent the escalation of any unintended incidents. I'm coming towards the end now, you'll be pleased and relieved to hear, and then we can have some question and answer. But I thought I should say a word about Hong Kong, which has been in the news a lot over the last few days. I had the great privilege of working in the Joint Liaison Group in the years running up to the handover of Hong Kong in 1997. And this was the joint UK-Chinese official body which discussed the detailed transitional arrangements. For me, Hong Kong has emerged as an extraordinary success story in UK-China relations, and it tells us something very, very important about our relationship. In the run-up to the handover, as I remember vividly, personally, there were many outside China who doubted the concept of one country, two systems. They doubted China's will or ability to abide by what by any standards was a pretty extraordinary and innovative constitutional arrangement. And I think history has shown that they were wrong. The British government has repeatedly assessed in its regular reviews of Hong Kong that the principle of one country, two systems is being broadly upheld in Hong Kong. Hong Kong, as anyone who's been there knows, is very, very different from a big mainland Chinese city. But on the other side, there was also mistrust. I think many on the Chinese side were suspicious about British intentions, convinced that the UK would somehow siphon Hong Kong's wealth away back to Britain before handing it over, or sabotage Hong Kong in some way. But the UK too abided by the commitments in the joint declaration which we signed with China. We handed Hong Kong back to China as a prosperous, well-administered city teeming with enterprise and ingenuity. So for our relationship, for the relationship between the UK and China, if Hong Kong tells us anything, it tells us that we can and should trust each other. And as for the demonstrations that have taken place recently, the British government has made its position clear. Hong Kong's prosperity and stability are underpinned by its fundamental rights and freedoms, including the right to demonstrate. And it's important for Hong Kong to preserve those rights and for Hong Kong people to exercise them within the law. Hong Kong's prosperity and stability are best served by a transition to universal suffrage, and the British government has encouraged all parties to engage constructively and take part in discussions in order to agree on arrangements that will actually allow a meaningful advance for democracy in Hong Kong and allow universal suffrage to be implemented in 2017. So, an opportunity, a need, and a risk. The world has seen some alarming and quite challenging developments recently. We've seen instability across much of the Middle East. We've seen Russian aggression towards its neighbor, Ukraine. We see deep political and economic challenges in the EU and the growth of nationalist politics across the EU. And now, on top of all that, we have the dreadful public health crisis of Ebola in West Africa. But I feel confident that when historians look back a century from now on the great events shaping our future, the re-emergence of China at the heart of the global economy, at the heart of global politics and culture, I think they will probably see that as the defining event of these times. I've been really privileged to have a ringside seat on that process during 5 years as British ambassador in China. And my main message, I'll just repeat once more, is that the UK and China have a historic opportunity today to be partners for growth and reform and innovation. We have started to take that opportunity. I think the statistics and the numbers prove that. But we're probably still only in the takeoff phase of a relationship which could soar very high indeed and could make a big contribution to China's transformation and bring an enormous new source of vitality to the UK in return. And to the young people who are here today, to the next generation, I hope very much that you will play your own role in taking that relationship to new heights in the future. Thank you very much.